You are staring into a mirror made of polished steel, and the face looking back at you is entirely too calm for a woman who has less than an hour left to live. Outside the small barred window of the Queen's house within the Tower of London, May morning is breaking over the River Thames. The air is thick with the scent of damp river stone, wood smoke, and the faint, sweet perfume of apple blossoms drifting from the gardens across the water. It is a beautiful morning to die. You can hear the distant, rhythmic thud of a carpenter's hammer. It is a steady, almost soothing sound, like a slow heartbeat. They are putting the final touches on a platform of fresh oak timbers, just a few hundred paces from where you stand. For 3 years, the entire kingdom of England revolved around your breath, your smile, the sharp wit of your tongue, and the dark, hypnotic depth of your eyes. Now, the world is narrowing down to the space of a scaffold, and the only sound that matters is the dull, repetitive striking of iron against wood. You do not feel the terror that the guards expected to see. For weeks, they watched you, expecting the hysterical tears, the pacing, the frantic prayers of a fallen queen desperate to save her neck. But a strange, heavy quiet has settled over your mind, a profound stillness that feels less like despair and more like a hard-won victory. You have spent years playing a game where every word was a dagger and every look was a political maneuver. Now that the game is over, the relief is almost intoxicating. The court of King Henry VIII was a place of permanent noise. The blare of hunting horns, the rustle of heavy silk trailing across marble floors, the endless, whispering conspiracies of men who would trade their own daughters for a scrap of royal favor. In this stone room, surrounded only by 4 walls and a few weeping ladies-in-waiting who cannot bear to look you in the eye, you have finally found something Henry could never give you. You have found silence. You reach up, your fingers grazing the fine, dark velvet of your gown. It is a deliberate choice, a rich, somber gray lined with a collar of white fur. Beneath it, a kirtle of crimson silk peeks through, a vivid slash of red that looks like a promise or a warning. The color of martyrs, the color of royalty. You refuse to dress like a victim. When you walk out onto that green, you will not look like a woman who was dragged to her ruin by the lies of jealous ministers. You will look like a queen who is simply stepping away from a banquet that has gone on far too long. Your ladies-in-waiting offer you a cup of spiced wine, their hands trembling so violently that the dark liquid splashes against the silver rim. You take it from them, your own hand perfectly steady, and you smile. It is the same sharp, enigmatic smile that once tore an ancient church away from Rome and set an entire island on fire. It is a smile that acknowledges the magnificent, absurd irony of it all. You remember how they used to whisper about those eyes. The Spanish ambassadors called them the eyes of a witch, dark and overly large, entirely un-English in their intensity. They said you used them to cast a spell over a king who had never been denied anything in his life. But as you look out through the iron bars, watching the morning mist rise off the Thames, like a shroud, you know there was no witchcraft. There was only a man who wanted what he could not have, and a woman who refused to be a temporary plaything. You gave him a glimpse of a world where a woman's mind could match his own, where intellect was more seductive than submission, and for that, he loved you with a fury that consumed everything in its path. For that, he will now kill you with the very same intensity. The line between his adoration and his hatred was always as thin as the blade currently waiting for you in the courtyard. You hear the heavy iron latch of the door lift. The sound echoes through the small chamber like a crack of thunder, breaking the soft rhythm of the carpenter's hammer outside. It is Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower. He enters with his head bowed, an old soldier who has seen 1,000 men go to their deaths, yet he cannot bring himself to look directly at your face. He tells you, in a voice that cracks with a strange, uncharacteristic softness, that the hour is drawing near. He apologizes for the delay. The executioner, a man brought all the way from Saint-Omer in France because he possesses a skill with the longsword that no English axeman can match, has been delayed on the river. Kingston expects you to break. He expects you to beg for a few more hours, a few more minutes of life. Instead, you let out a soft, melodic laugh that startles everyone in the room. You tell him that you hear the executioner is very good and that you have a very little neck. You wrap your fingers gently around your throat, feeling the delicate pulse beating steadily beneath your skin. It is an image that will haunt Kingston for the rest of his days. A queen joking about the smallness of her neck on the morning of her slaughter, her eyes bright with an almost cheerful detachment. You are not mocking death. You are mocking the men who think they are defeating you by delivering it. They think they are erasing you from history, scrubbing your name from the palace walls, and melting down your gold plate. They do not realize that by sending you to the scaffold, they are making you immortal. You watch the sunlight shift across the stone floor, tracing the slow, deliberate march of time. Every second is a physical thing now, heavy and loaded with memory. Your mind drifts back through the noise of the trials, the shouted accusations of adultery, of incest, of plotting the king's death. Monstrous, fabricated lies designed to look like justice. You sat in the great hall of the tower just days ago, watching your own uncle pronounce the sentence of death, his voice shaking while you sat perfectly straight, your face a mask of serene indifference. They wanted a show of broken pride. They wanted you to scream your innocence or crawl on your knees for mercy, but you knew that innocence was a currency that had no value in Henry's court. The verdict had been written in the lines of his forehead months ago, the moment he realized you would not bear him the son he so desperately needed to secure his dynasty. You look down at your hands, noting the long, elegant fingers that once played the lute so beautifully in the Queen's apartments at Greenwich. The gossips always claimed you had a sixth finger on your right hand, a deformity that proved your pact with the devil. You look at it now, just 5 fingers, smooth and pale, unblemished except for the rings you were forced to surrender when you entered these gates. The myths have already outgrown the woman. To the traditionalists who hated the new religious ideas you brought from France, you were the great whore, the seductions that led a pious king astray. To the reformers, you were a Protestant heroine, a vessel of divine light who broke the power of the Pope in England. But as you stand in the quiet of this morning, you know you were neither a saint nor a monster. You were simply a human being who dared to think she could navigate the treacherous currents of a Tudor court without losing her soul. You hear the footsteps now, not just Kingston's, but the heavy, synchronized tread of the guard. They are coming to lead you down. The air in the room suddenly feels colder, as if the castle itself is holding its breath. Your ladies begin to sob openly now, their grief filling the small space with a suffocating weight. You turn to them, your voice steady and warm, and you comfort them. You tell them not to weep for you, but to rejoice that your suffering is coming to an end. You help them secure your hair, pinning it tightly beneath a gray coif, so that the back of your neck is completely bare, completely accessible. Every movement is deliberate, every gesture a masterclass in royal dignity. You are directing your own final scene, ensuring that not a single person present will ever be able to say that Anne Boleyn died with a coward's heart. You step out into the hallway, the stones smooth beneath your shoes. The corridor is lined with guards, holding halberds, their faces pale and rigid under their iron helmets. As you walk past them, the silence follows you, a heavy, reverent quiet that spreads through the fortress. You are moving toward the light of the courtyard, where a small crowd of dignitaries has gathered to watch a king's love turn into a king's vengeance. You can feel the cool breeze of the river hitting your face as you exit the threshold of the stone tower. The sky is a pale, brilliant blue, completely indifferent to the human tragedy unfolding beneath it. You take your first step onto the green, your eyes fixed not on the wooden platform or the man dressed in black, holding a long, gleaming piece of French steel, but on the horizon beyond the walls. You are stepping into the dark, but you are doing it with your head held high, leaving behind a silence that will ring louder through the halls of England than any crown ever could. You are standing in the deep, damp grass of the Kent countryside, long before the name Boleyn became a whisper of treason and a synonym for a crown. The air here at Hever Castle does not smell of river mud and fear. It smells of wild roses, turned earth, and the clean, sharp scent of an English autumn. You are a child again, or perhaps a young girl on the cusp of understanding that your life does not belong to you, but to the ambitions of men who weigh your worth in alliances, dowries, and the purity of your bloodline. The stone walls of your family home are modest compared to the sprawling palaces that will later become your prisons, but they possess a quiet, grounding security. Here, the world is still small enough to be understood, yet, even in this rural isolation, the shadow of London and the insatiable hunger of the court stretches out like a long, grasping hand. You look down at your hands, smaller now, unburdened by the heavy rings of state, and you remember the first time you realized that your family was different. The Boleyns were not ancient nobility. They did not arrive with the conqueror, nor did they possess the deep, centuries-old roots of the Howards or the Percys. Your grandfather was a merchant, a man of London who accumulated wealth through trade, silk, and sheer financial intelligence. This is the first wound, the foundational trauma that you will carry into every grand room you ever inhabit. The knowledge that, to the old aristocracy, you are an upstart. You are the granddaughter of a merchant, a clever interloper, masquerading as a lady. It is a slight you will never forget, and it breeds in you a fierce, defensive pride. You learn early that if the world will not grant you respect by right of birth, you must conquer it by force of intellect and will. You remember the sudden, jarring transition when you were torn away from the misty fields of Kent and sent across the sea to the glittering, sophisticated courts of Europe, first to the Netherlands, under the sharp, watchful eye of Margaret of Austria, and then to France, where the Renaissance was unfolding in a riot of philosophy, poetry, and dangerous new ideas. You are stepping off a ship into a world that feels entirely alive, vibrant in a way England never was. In France, at the court of Queen Claude and the magnificent, predatory King Francis I, you do not learn how to be a submissive English wife. You learn how to survive in a palace where love is a political weapon and conversation is a deadly sport. You watch the French ladies handle power with a delicate, gloved touch, influencing policy through the sheer brilliance of their conversation, their mastery of poetry, and their refusal to be mere decorative objects in a man's world. You absorb everything. You learn to speak French so perfectly that the English accent disappears from your tongue entirely. You learn the intricate steps of the most complex dances, the subtle art of the lute, and the precise, devastating power of a lingering glance. But more importantly, you read. You sit in the sun-drenched galleries of the French chateau and immerse yourself in the writings of religious reformers, humanists, and philosophers who dare to suggest that scripture should be understood by the individual, not just dictated by a distant pope in Rome. These are dangerous, intoxicating thoughts for a young girl from Kent. They form the inner architecture of your mind, a fierce independence of thought that will later shake the foundations of your homeland. You are no longer just an English girl. You have been remade into something cosmopolitan, something sharp, something entirely unique. You return to England as a stranger in your own country. When you walk into the Tudor court at Greenwich, you are like a splash of vivid color in a room painted in dull, traditional shades. The English court is a heavy, masculine place, dominated by the booming voice of a young Henry VIII and the traditional, domestic expectations placed upon women. They expect you to be quiet, to be pious in the old, unthinking way, to sew tapestry in the corner, and wait for a marriage to be arranged for you by your father. But you have forgotten how to be small. You step into the great hall, and the room goes quiet. You are not a conventional beauty. Your skin is too dark for the pale English ideal. Your mouth is too wide, and your eyes are an intense, obsidian black that seems to see right through the superficial flattery of the courtiers. But you possess something far more dangerous than beauty. You possess allure. You have an atmosphere. You remember the first man who truly saw you, the one who almost changed the course of your destiny before the king ever noticed your existence. Henry Percy, the heir to the massive, ancient earldom of Northumberland. He is young, impressionable, and completely undone by your French manners and sharp wit. With him, you taste the possibility of a different kind of life, a life of wealth, security, and quiet power in the wild, northern reaches of England. Far away from the toxic center of the court, you exchange secret vows in the shadows of the gallery, a private contract of marriage that feels like a shield against the ambitions of your family. For a brief moment, you allow yourself to believe that you can choose your own path, that love can be a sanctuary rather than a transaction. But the illusion is shattered with a brutality that teaches you your second great lesson about power. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the king's all-powerful minister, discovers the match. You are summoned to a confrontation that feels like an interrogation. Wolsey, a man of low birth who has risen to become the true ruler of England, looks down his nose at you and tears your engagement apart with a few cold, calculated words. He tells Percy that he is a fool to throw himself away on a woman of your station, and he orders your father to drag you back to Hever Castle in disgrace. You are banished from the court, sent back to the quiet fields of Kent like a corrected child. The humiliation is a physical weight in your chest, a burning, corrosive anger that changes you forever. You realize that in this world, if you do not hold the highest card, you are nothing but a pawn to be discarded by men like Wolsey. As you sit in the silence of Hever, watching the rain beat against the window, the soft, romantic girl who loved Henry Percy dies. In her place, a cold, calculating strategist is born. You swear an oath to yourself that you will return to that court, and when you do, you will become so powerful that no cardinal, no minister, and no man will ever be able to banish you again. You spend months in that rural exile, a time of profound internal hardening. While your family worries about the damage to your reputation, you use the isolation to refine your weapons. You read more deeply, you think more clearly, and you watch from afar as your sister, Mary, is brought into the king's bed. Mary is gentle, sweet, and entirely compliant. The perfect royal mistress. You watch as she bears the king children, only to be cast aside when his volatile attention wanders, left with nothing but a ruined reputation and a family that has already extracted every ounce of social advancement her body could provide. This is the ultimate lesson, the blueprint of what you must never allow yourself to become. You see your sister's fate, and you make a vow. You will never be a king's mistress. You will never give your virtue for a temporary title or a handful of jewels, only to be replaced when a newer, fresher face catches the sovereign's eye. If Henry Tudor wants you, he will have to pay a price that no English king has ever paid for a woman. You are finally recalled to court, your banishment lifted, and you walk back into the palace, not as a victim, but as a predator disguised as prey. You are older now, your edges sharper, your smile more guarded. You catch the eye of the king during a court pageant, where you are dressed in white silk, playing the virtue of kindness in a performance designed to entertain the nobility. Henry, a man who has grown bored of his aging Spanish queen, Catherine of Aragon, and tired of the easy compliance of court ladies, looks at you and sees a fortress he cannot easily storm. He begins to pursue you with the clumsy, overwhelming force of a man who has never been told no. He sends you letters filled with grand declarations of love. He sends you rare jewels. He corners you in the galleries, expecting the same quick surrender he received from your sister. But you understand the psychology of the hunter. You know that for a man like Henry, the only thing more intoxicating than possession is denial. Every time he reaches for you, you step back into the shadows with a respectful, devastating curtsy. You tell him that your honor is your only dowry, and that you would rather die a virgin than live as a discarded mistress. You do not shout. You do not anger him. You deliver this refusal with a soft, French-accented voice and a look from those dark eyes that promises a paradise you are entirely prepared to withhold. You make yourself an enigma, a puzzle he cannot solve, a prize that remains permanently just out of his reach. The more you retreat, the more obsessed he becomes, until the desire for you begins to warp his judgment, his policy, and his kingdom. You watch him change from a confident monarch into a desperate lover, spending his nights writing poetry to you, while his ministers look on in growing horror. They think it is a temporary madness, a passing itch that will be scratched and forgotten. They do not understand that you are playing a game with stakes so high that a single misstep means ruin. You are balancing on a tightrope over an abyss. If you give in too soon, you become Mary Boleyn, used and forgotten. If you refuse too harshly, you risk the anger of a tyrant who could crush your family with a word. And so, you walk the line with an agonizingly perfect precision, holding his heart in your hand while your own remains perfectly cool, perfectly detached. You are transforming your childhood trauma, your merchant lineage, and your past humiliations into the fuel for a revolution that will change the face of the Western world. You are no longer just Anne Boleyn of Kent. You are becoming the pivot upon which the history of an empire turns. You are standing at the high-arched window of the palace at Greenwich, watching the autumn leaves detach themselves from the oaks and drift aimlessly down into the gray, churning waters of the Thames. For 7 years, your life has been a calculated exercise in strategic distance, a prolonged, high-stakes siege where you are both the fortress being assaulted and the general directing the defense. 7 years of refusing the king's touch while occupying his every waking thought. It is an achievement that defies the very nature of courtly romance and royal prerogative. No woman in the history of England has ever held a sovereign at bay for so long without either succumbing to his power or being crushed by his wrath. But you have done it by transforming denial into an art form, making your virtue look like a holy citadel, and your intellect look like the only key that can unlock the king's true potential. You look down at the letter, resting on the heavy oak table beside you, written in Henry's own frantic, sprawling hand. He writes to you not as a master commanding a subject, but as a supplicant begging for a sign of grace. He signs his name beneath a hand-drawn heart, a grand, almost pathetic gesture from a man who rules millions of lives with an absolute, unquestioned authority. You do not smile when you read his desperate professions of love. Instead, you feel the cold, heavy weight of the machinery you have set in motion. This is no longer a simple courtship. It has become a theological war, a diplomatic crisis that has set the capitals of Europe ablaze with fury and panic. To win you, Henry is not merely offering a title or an estate. He is prepared to tear down the ancient fabric of his kingdom, to sever his ties with the Holy Roman Empire, and to turn his back on the Pope, who once declared him the defender of the faith. You have become the living axis upon which the entire Western world is pivoting. You remember the endless, exhausting theological debates that have filled your private chambers during these years of waiting, while the rest of the court spends its nights in drunken revelry or shallow gambling. You sit by the candlelight with the forbidden books you smuggled out of France, the works of Tyndale, Lefebvre, and the radical thinkers who argue that a king answers only to God, not to a bishop in Rome. You did not just show Henry your dark eyes and your elegant dances. You showed him these pages. You pointed your long, elegant finger at the passages that validated his secret, burning desire. The idea that his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was an abomination in the eyes of God, and that his lack of a male heir was a divine punishment for living in sin. You did not have to convince him. You merely gave him the intellectual weapons to convince himself. You gave his lust the dignity of a spiritual crusade. You watched the slow, agonizing destruction of Cardinal Wolsey, the very man who once banished you to Kent with a sneer of aristocratic contempt. The memory of that humiliation has never left you, acting as a quiet, steady flame that kept your resolve burning through the coldest nights of your exile. Now, the tables have turned with a terrifying completeness. Wolsey, the great diplomat who boasted that he could manipulate popes and emperors, has met an obstacle he cannot conquer: the obstinate refusal of Rome to grant Henry his divorce, and your own unwavering determination to see the cardinal fall. Every time Wolsey fails to secure the annulment from the Vatican, you are there in Henry's ear, whispering softly, casting doubt on the cardinal's loyalty, suggesting that a servant of the Pope can never truly be a servant of the king. You watch from the shadows as the old man's wealth is stripped away, his palace is seized, his spirit broken, until he dies on his way to the scaffold. It is a lesson in the absolute volatility of royal favor, a reminder that the higher you climb in Henry's world, the sharper the drop will be when you fall. You tell yourself that you will be different, that you will secure your position so deeply that no one can ever undermine you. You feel the atmosphere of the court changing around you, turning toxic and hostile as the old nobility realizes that you are not going away. To the traditionalists, you are an infection, a dark-skinned heretic who is driving a beloved king to madness and heresy. When you walk through the presence chambers, the whispers stop, replaced by a cold, heavy silence that is far more dangerous than any spoken insult. You see the hatred in the eyes of the great lords, the intersection of class snobbery and misogyny. They could accept a king having a low-born mistress. That was an established tradition, a temporary distraction that could be managed. But they cannot accept a woman who demands the crown as the price of her body, a woman who sits in the Privy Council and debates foreign policy with foreign ambassadors. They look at you and they see an existential threat to the social order. You remember the night a mob of thousands of London women marched on the villa where you were dining, carrying torches and shouting for your blood, calling you the bully queen and a whore who had bewitched their sovereign. You were forced to escape down the river in an open boat, the shouts of the crowd echoing over the dark water behind you. It was the first time you realized the sheer scale of the hatred that awaited you outside the palace walls. The common people loved Catherine of Aragon. She was the pious, suffering mother of the nation, the daughter of Spain who represented stability and tradition. You were the interloper, the foreign-looking disruptor who brought bad harvests, religious strife, and the threat of war with the Holy Roman Emperor. But the terror of that night did not break your spirit. It hardened it. It made you realize that you could never rely on the love of the people or the loyalty of the lords. Your only shield, your only sanctuary, was the absolute, total control you held over the mind and will of Henry Tudor. You watched the king begin the great rupture, the systematic dismantling of the Catholic Church in England, under the guidance of your ally, Thomas Cromwell, a man of low birth and immense, ruthless intelligence like yourself. The Parliament begins to pass laws that strip the bishops of their power and declare the king to be the supreme head of the Church of England. It is a breathtaking, terrifying act of political audacity. You sit beside Henry, as he signs the decrees that sever 1,000 years of spiritual tradition with a single stroke of a pen. You see the mixture of exhilaration and terror in his eyes. He is stepping into the unknown, defying the spiritual authority of the entire Christian world, all because he cannot live without the promise of what lies between your thighs and the son he believes you carry in your womb. You are no longer just a woman. You have become a historical force, an instrument of destiny that is breaking an old world to pieces so that a new one can be born. You are finally elevated to the peerage in your own right, the Marquis of Pembroke, an unprecedented honor for an unmarried woman. Henry invests you with the title in a grand ceremony at Windsor, dressing you in a mantle of crimson velvet, furred with ermine, dropping the gold coronet onto your dark hair with his own hands. It is a moment of profound vindication. You stand before the assembled nobility of England, the very men who sneered at your merchant grandfather, and you look down at them from the dais. They are forced to bow to you, to swear fealty to you, their faces tight with suppressed rage, while you receive their homage with a cool, aristocratic grace. You have conquered them on their own ground, using nothing but your wits and the king's obsession. You remember the journey to Calais, the final prologue to your triumph. Henry takes you to France to meet King Francis I, seeking the French king's endorsement for your upcoming marriage. It is a return to the land of your youth. But you return not as a humble maid of honor, but as the future Queen of England. You dance before the two kings in a mask, your face hidden behind a mask of gold cloth, your movements so fluid and enchanting that Francis himself declares you to be a woman of transcendent grace. It is during this voyage, amidst the sea mists and the celebratory gunfire of the English garrison, that you finally surrender to Henry's embrace. After 7 years of waiting, the fortress opens its gates. It is not an act of passion, it is an act of state. You give him your body only when the crown is firmly within your grasp, when the laws have been rewritten, and the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, is ready to declare your union lawful in the eyes of God. You return to England carrying the seed of the future. You are pregnant, and the knowledge of that growing life inside you sends a wave of frantic energy through the court. The secret marriage takes place in a small drafty turret room at Whitehall in the deep of winter. Before the dawn breaks, there are only a handful of witnesses, a priest sworn to secrecy, a few loyal servants who stand guard at the door. It is a quiet, almost domestic contrast to the decades of geopolitical storm that led up to it. As you exchange the vows, listening to the wind howl against the stone walls, you feel a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. You have reached the summit of your ambition. You have broken an empire and remade a church to get here. But as you look at Henry's face in the flickering candlelight, a face that has grown heavier, more lined, and more volatile during the long years of your courtship, you realize that the crown you are about to receive is not a shield. It is a target. You have spent 7 years climbing the mountain. Now, you must learn how to survive on the frozen, wind-swept peak, where the air is thin and the only way down is a long, fatal fall into the dark. You are sitting on a throne of carved oak and gilded lilies in Westminster Abbey, the ancient crown of St. Edward, resting so heavily on your brow that your neck muscles ache under its physical weight. The air inside the great cathedral is thick with the suffocating smoke of 1,000 wax candles, the rich, oily scent of chrism oil still wet on your forehead, and the distinct, chilly dampness of ancient stone. The choir is singing a magnificent, soaring Te Deum that shakes the very rafters above you, a wall of sacred sound meant to signify the approval of heaven itself. But as you look out over the sea of faces filling the nave, you do not see joy. You see a tapestry of frozen masks. Below you stand the dukes, the earls, the bishops, and the foreign ambassadors, all dressed in their finest robes of state, their lips moving in mechanical praise, while their eyes remain flat, hard, and entirely devoid of warmth. They are bowing to their new queen, but their bodies are rigid with a silent, collective resistance. You are at the absolute center of the world, yet you have never been more profoundly alone. You look to your right, where King Henry sits on his own elevated chair of estate. He is radiant, his massive frame draped in cloth of gold and slashed white satin, his face flushed with the pride of a man who has successfully defied the entire world to claim his prize. He looks at you with a predatory, triumphant adoration. To him, this coronation is the ultimate validation of his absolute will. He has broken the laws of Christendom, alienated his closest allies, and humiliated his people to place this crown on your dark hair. But even as he reaches out to press your hand with his heavy, jewel-encrusted fingers, you feel the invisible, terrifying tether that binds your survival to his whim. You are no longer his elusive muse, the mysterious woman who could vanish into the safety of the Kent countryside when the court became too dangerous. You are his wife now. You are his property, and most importantly, you are the vessel that must deliver the male heir he has promised to his kingdom and his God. You remember the long, grueling days of your coronation, progress through the streets of London just 24 hours earlier. Your father and uncle had arranged a spectacle of unprecedented magnificence. Fountains running with red wine, elaborate street pageants featuring mechanical angels and classical goddesses singing your praises, the houses along Cheapside, hung with expensive tapestries of velvet and gold cloth. You rode through the crowds in a litter of white satin, your long dark hair falling loose over your shoulders, a circle of rubies catching the bright summer sun. It was designed to be a triumph that would silence your detractors forever, but the city refused to play its part. As your litter moved through the narrow, crowded streets, the people stood in a sullen, heavy silence. They did not lift their hats. They did not shout, "God save the Queen." When your own fools and heralds commanded the crowd to cheer for you, a few brave souls shouted back the name of Catherine, the discarded queen they still considered their true mother. Someone in the crowd laughed openly at your initials, A and H, intertwined on a triumphal arch, shouting that it was nothing but a joke. You sat perfectly straight, your face frozen into a serene, aristocratic smile that masked the bitter, burning humiliation eating away at your stomach. You learned in those long miles across London that a crown can buy obedience, but it can never buy legitimacy. You feel the walls of your new reality closing in around you during your first winter as queen at Whitehall and Greenwich. The transformation from mistress to wife is a sudden, brutal shock to the system. For years, your power lay in your independence, in your ability to challenge Henry's mind and mock his pomposity without fear of consequence. But inside the domestic trap of marriage, that same sharp intelligence is no longer seen as an asset. It is seen as a dangerous defect. Henry did not marry a political partner. He married a queen consort whose primary duty is submission and reproduction. When you speak your mind in the Privy Council chambers, when you argue with him over foreign policy or criticize his choice of ministers, his face no longer lightens with the amused fascination of a lover. Instead, it darkens with the volatile anger of a monarch who expects his household to be a sanctuary of absolute obedience. He reminds you, in a voice that drops into a low, terrifying growl, that he can lower you just as easily as he raised you, and that you should keep your eyes on your embroidery rather than his state affairs. You find yourself retreating into the magnificent, isolated labyrinth of the Queen's apartments, a world within a world, where you are surrounded by a court of your own choosing, yet permanently watched by enemies you cannot see. You spend your mornings surrounded by your ladies-in-waiting, the rustle of their silk skirts and the quiet hum of their spinning wheels, filling the chambers with a deceptive illusion of domestic peace. You try to recreate the intellectual vibrancy of the French court you loved so dearly, surrounding yourself with young, handsome courtiers who understand the subtle arts of poetry, music, and courtly wit, men like your brilliant brother George, the elegant poet Thomas Wyatt, and Henry Norris, the king's closest personal attendant. They bring life into your rooms, filling the long winter evenings with the sweet, melancholy strains of the lute and the sharp, playful banter of intellectual flirtation. It is a necessary escape, a way to remind yourself that you are still a woman capable of inspiring admiration, not just a biological instrument waiting to fulfill a dynastic contract. But you know that every conversation in these rooms is being recorded by invisible eyes and reported back to those who hate you. The traditionalist factions, now led by your own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a cold, pragmatic politician who views you not as a niece but as a family investment that must yield a profit, are watching for any sign of a misstep. They resent your continued patronage of religious reformers, your insistence that the wealth of the dissolved monasteries should be used for education and charity, rather than lining the pockets of the nobility. They see your lively, French-style court not as a center of culture, but as a breeding ground for vanity, heresy, and loose morals. You are forced to live with your defenses permanently raised, weighing every smile, analyzing every casual remark, knowing that a single careless word could be twisted into a weapon of treason by men who are simply waiting for you to stumble. You remember the day the ultimate test arrived, the birth of your first child at Greenwich Palace in the damp, fading light of September. The royal astrologers and physicians had unanimously assured the king that the child in your womb was a prince, a glorious boy who would secure the Tudor line forever. Henry had already prepared the letters announcing the birth of a prince, leaving a blank space for the final word, and had organized a grand celebratory tournament that would shake the fields of Kent. When the labor pains finally tore through your body, you prayed with a frantic, desperate intensity, offering up your soul to God in exchange for a son. But when the midwife finally held the infant up into the candlelight, the room fell into a horrifying, dead silence. It was a girl, a healthy, perfectly formed girl, with your own dark eyes and a shock of red hair that matched her father's. You will never forget the expression on Henry's face when he walked into your bedchamber to see his new daughter. There was no joy, no tenderness, no relief that you had survived a long and dangerous labor. There was only a cold, stunned disbelief that hardened into a quiet, resentful fury. He looked at the child, the infant Elizabeth, as if she were a personal insult from God, a divine rejection of everything he had sacrificed to marry you. He canceled the tournament, ordered the letters of celebration to be hastily altered by adding an S to the word prince, and left your chambers after a few brief, formal words of consolation. As you held your daughter against your breast in the quiet, darkened room, listening to the small, fragile sound of her breathing, you felt a cold dread settle deep into your bones. You realized that your position was not a fortress at all. It was a glass house, and the first crack had just appeared in the foundation. The king's love was not unconditional. It was a line of credit that you had just begun to overdraw. You watched the king's attention begin to wander, his eyes drifting toward the younger, quieter women who inhabit the outer edges of your court. He is a man who craves constant validation, a man who cannot endure the heavy, accusing weight of disappointment. When you confront him about his infidelities, your voice rising with the natural, justifiable fury of a wife who has sacrificed her youth and her safety for his bed, he turns on you with a cold, detached cruelty that leaves you breathless. He tells you that you must close your eyes to his behavior, just as your betters had done before you. A direct, vicious reference to Catherine of Aragon. He reminds you that your entire existence depends on his pleasure, and that if you cannot give him the peace he desires in his home, he will look for it elsewhere. The realization hits you like a physical blow. The very qualities that made you irresistible as a mistress, your fire, your passion, your fierce independence, are the very things he now detests in you as a wife. He wants a statue, a silent, obedient mother for his princes, not a living woman with a mind of her own. You enter into your second pregnancy with a frantic, feverish determination that borders on madness. You isolate yourself even further, spending your days in prayer, surrounding yourself with the scriptures, placing your hand on your growing stomach, and begging the Almighty to turn the child into a boy. Every movement of the baby inside you is scrutinized, every symptom analyzed by your anxious physicians. You know that this child is your shield, your only defense against the growing influence of your enemies, who are already whispering to the king that his marriage to you is cursed in the eyes of heaven, just as his first marriage was. The pressure is a suffocating, physical weight that never leaves you, turning your food to ash in your mouth and robbing you of your sleep. You look in your mirror at night, away from the painted masks of the court, and you see the hollows beneath your eyes, the sharp lines of tension around your mouth. You are only in your early 30s, yet you look like a woman who has lived a century in the space of 3 years. You are a prisoner of your own ambition, locked inside a golden cage of your own design, watching the bars grow narrower with every passing hour. You are sitting in the absolute darkness of your bedchamber at Greenwich, listening to the heavy, regular breathing of a king who has become a stranger to you even as he sleeps by your side. The winter of 1536 has set in with a brutal, bone-chilling intensity that matches the frost hardening around your own heart. Outside, the world is wrapped in ice, the grand oak trees of the park standing like skeletal sentinels against a gray, unforgiving sky. You lie perfectly still, staring up at the heavy velvet canopy of the royal bed, terrified that if you move even an inch, you will shatter the fragile illusion of safety that you have spent the last 3 years frantically trying to maintain. The sheets feel cold against your skin, lacking the warmth of genuine affection, smelling only of heavy starch and the musk of a man whose love has sold into a restless, suspicious resentment. You are a queen, yes, but you are also a hostage to a womb that has failed to deliver the one thing this kingdom demands. You remember the catastrophic moment just days ago that turned the cold undercurrent of your life into an open, raging torrent of disaster. It was January 24th, a day that began with the bright, deceptive clarity of a winter sun. A grand joust had been organized at Greenwich, a spectacle of masculine violence and chivalry meant to distract the king from his growing political anxieties. You watched from the high gallery as Henry, mounted on a massive warhorse and encased in polished steel armor, thundered down the tilt yard, his lance held high. He was 44 years old, no longer the slender, athletic prince of his youth, but a heavy, lumbering giant driven by a desperate need to prove that his virility and strength remained unbroken by time. You watched the collision, the sharp, deafening splintering of oak against steel, and then, in a heartbeat that seemed to stretch out into an eternity, the king's horse stumbled, rolled, and collapsed directly on top of him. You remember the sound that rose from the tilt yard, a collective, horrified gasp from thousands of throats that suddenly cut off into a dead, suffocating silence. For 2 hours, the King of England lay unconscious in the dirt, his massive frame motionless beneath the weight of his armored beast. In those 2 hours of terrifying vacuum, you saw your entire universe dissolve before your eyes. You knew with an absolute, crystalline certainty that if Henry died that afternoon, you were finished. Your daughter Elizabeth was an infant. Your marriage was considered illegitimate by half of Europe, and the old Catholic nobility was already preparing to march on London to place Mary, Catherine's daughter, on the throne. Your enemies would not have hesitated. They would have dragged you from the palace and torn you to pieces on the green before the sun had even set. You stood in the gallery, your hands gripping the stone railing until your knuckles turned white, realizing that the man you had spent a decade manipulating was the only shield standing between your life and a brutal, merciless slaughter. When Henry finally opened his eyes, groaning in agony as his physicians dragged him from beneath the horse, the immediate danger passed, but the psychic damage was permanent and irreversible. The fall had opened an ancient, festering wound in his leg, but more importantly, it had cracked something deep within his mind. The untouchable sovereign had tasted his own mortality. The tyrant had realized he could be broken by a simple stumble of a horse. When he was carried back to his apartments, his face pale and twisted with pain, he looked at you not with relief, but with a strange, searching hostility. He believed, with the superstitious intensity of a true tutor, that the accident was a sign from God, another warning that his house was built upon an unholy foundation, that the heavens were still displeased with his second marriage. The terror and stress of those 2 hours tore into your own body with a devastating biological fury. You were 5 months pregnant, carrying the boy that was supposed to solve everything, the son who would have silenced the whispers of the ministers and secured your lineage for a generation. But your body could not sustain the weight of the fear. Just 5 days after the king's fall, on the very day that Catherine of Aragon was being buried in a cold, distant grave at Peterborough, the labor pains came upon you months too soon. You remember the agony of that night, not just the physical pain of the miscarriage, but the spiritual horror of watching your last, best hope slip away into a basin of bloody linen. It was a boy, a perfectly formed, stillborn prince, who would never draw a breath, never wear a crown, and never save his mother from the wolves waiting outside her door. You will never forget the moment Henry walked into your darkened chamber to look upon the consequence of your failure. He did not offer a hand to comfort you. He did not weep for the son he had lost. He stood at the foot of your bed, like a judge delivering a final verdict. His voice was cold, thin, and entirely devoid of human feeling. He told you that he saw clearly now that God would not give him male children by you. He spoke of his marriage, not as a great romance that had reshuffled the map of Europe, but as a deception, an enchantment that had led him into a spiritual wasteland. He told you, with a chilling, businesslike detachment, that he would speak to Cromwell about his options, and then he turned his back on you and walked out of the room, leaving you alone in the silence of your grief and your growing terror. You watch Thomas Cromwell now, your former ally, the man you helped elevate to the position of the king's chief minister, as he begins to turn his brilliant, administrative mind toward your destruction. Cromwell is a political realist, a man who reads the winds of royal favor with the precision of a master mariner. He sees that the king's obsession has completely burned out, replaced by a deep, visceral disgust and a new, burning infatuation with Jane Seymour, a pale, quiet, submissive girl from an old family who represents the exact opposite of your sharp, exhausting brilliance. Cromwell knows that Henry wants to be rid of you, but he also knows that a second divorce would be a diplomatic nightmare that would make England look ridiculous in the eyes of the world. A divorce would mean admitting that the king had been wrong twice, that his break with Rome had been based on a mistake. To satisfy his master, Cromwell cannot merely dissolve the marriage. He must destroy the woman. He must make you so monstrous, so utterly indefensible, that your execution will look like an act of holy purification. You feel the trap closing around you during the bright, cruel days of April. Suddenly, the nature of the courtly love games you played in your apartments is transformed into a blueprint for treason. Cromwell's spies are everywhere, listening to the casual, playful banter between you and your gentleman friends, recording every witty remark, every exaggerated declaration of devotion that was standard currency in the French-style court. They take these light, meaningless flirtations, the poetic, courtly love that everyone knew was a game, and they reframe them as a dark, widespread conspiracy of adultery, incest, and high treason. They arrest Mark Smeaton, the young, low-born musician whose beautiful lute playing had so often enlivened your evenings. They drag him to Cromwell's house, and there, in the dark, they use the cord and the rack until the boy is broken, forcing him to confess to a lie, that he had entered your bed and known the body of the queen. The madness spreads like an ink blot through the palace. One by one, your closest friends are swept up into the Tower. Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, men of high birth who had done nothing but admire your wit and serve your household. But the ultimate, most vicious blow is delivered when they arrest your own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Your enemies look at the deep, intellectual bond between you, the way you whispered together in French, your shared laughter at the pomposity of the old lords, and they turn it into the most monstrous accusation of all: incest. They claim that you, desperate to conceive a son at any cost, had turned to your own brother's bed. It is a charge designed not just to kill you, but to completely erase your humanity, to turn you into a creature so unnatural that even those who once supported your religious reforms will turn away from you in disgust. You are arrested on May 2nd, during the Royal May Day celebrations at Greenwich. You are watching the tournaments, trying to maintain your royal composure despite the terrifying absence of your friends from the field, when Henry suddenly stands up without a word, abandons the games, and rides away to London with only a small escort, leaving you behind like an infected thing. An hour later, the king's uncle and your own father walk into your apartments with a detachment of guards. They present you with a warrant signed by the king's own hand. You are taken down to the river, placed in an open barge under the heavy guard of halberdiers, and rowed up the Thames toward the Tower of London, the very same route you took 3 years ago for your coronation, through the very same waters that once ran red with celebratory wine. You pass beneath the heavy iron portcullis of Traitor's Gate, the damp stone arches dripping river water onto your velvet gown like cold tears. As you step out of the boat onto the slippery wooden stairs, the reality of your situation finally breaks through your aristocratic defenses. You fall to your knees on the cold stones, weeping frantically, crying out to God that you are innocent of these monstrous crimes. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, lifts you gently, his face a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He leads you not to the dark, damp dungeons beneath the fortress, but to the grand, luxurious rooms of the Queen's house, the exact same apartments where you spent the nights before your coronation, awaiting your crown. The irony is a physical torture. You sit in the gilded chairs, looking at the tapestries that still bear your initials, realizing that every room you have ever inhabited has been a stage, and that the final act has already been written by a playwright who does not allow for a happy ending. You spend the days leading up to your trial in a state of high, feverish anxiety that oscillates between frantic hope and a calm, philosophical acceptance of your fate. You pace the stone floors, your mind racing through every conversation you ever had, trying to understand how a life of such calculating intelligence could have led to such a complete and total ruin. You realize that your great mistake was believing that Henry was a man who could be bound by gratitude or logic. You thought that because you had given him a new church and a new empire, he would always protect you. You did not understand that a tyrant does not want to be reminded of what he owes to a woman. He wants to believe that everything he possesses is a result of his own divine right. By becoming his wife, you surrendered the only weapon you had, your distance, and allowed yourself to be dragged into an arena where he held all the cards. You are no longer the queen who smiled on the throne. You are the quarry that has been successfully cornered by the hounds, waiting for the final. mortal blow in the dark. You are standing before a massive pair of oak doors inside the Great Hall of the Tower of London, listening to the muffled, restless murmur of 2,000 people packed into the space just beyond the wood. It is May 15th. The air inside this ancient fortress is thick, hot, and heavy with the scent of unwashed wool, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of collective anticipation. This is the day of your trial. For weeks, the machinery of Thomas Cromwell has been grinding in secret, collecting the forced confessions, the twisted dates, and the fabricated timelines necessary to ensure your destruction. Now, the curtain is going up on the final, legal theater that will give your execution the appearance of justice. You can feel the vibration of the crowd's feet through the thick soles of your velvet shoes, a low, rhythmic rumble that feels like the growl of a beast waiting to devour you. You look down at your dress one last time, smoothing the rich, dark fabric with your long fingers. You have chosen to wear a robe of black velvet, heavy and unadorned, which opens over a kirtle of beautiful scarlet silk. It is a calculated visual statement, a brilliant manipulation of courtly iconography, black for mourning, for the injustice that is about to be committed against you, red for the blood of a martyr, for the royal dignity that they are trying to strip away. On your head sits a small, elegant hood of English fashion, pinned tightly over your hair, revealing the pale, steady lines of your face. You refuse to look like a criminal. When those doors open, you will not crawl into that hall like a broken woman begging for her life. You will enter it with the slow, majestic glide of a sovereign who is simply holding court in a different room. You take a long, deep breath of the damp tower air, steadying your pulse, and you nod to the guards. The heavy oak doors swing outward with a loud, groaning creak that cuts through the noise of the hall like a knife. A sudden, dead silence falls over the crowd as you step across the threshold. 2,000 pairs of eyes fix upon you, searching your face for any sign of fear, any tear, any tremor of the lip that would validate their hatred. Instead, they see a woman who looks entirely at peace. You walk with a serene, floating grace down the long aisle toward the raised platform where your judges sit. Your enemies had expected a fallen woman, a disgraced whore hiding her face in shame. Instead, they are forced to look upon a queen whose poise is so absolute that it makes the very lords sitting in judgment look like the criminals. You look up at the dais where the 26 peers of the realm are seated in a grand semicircle, their faces illuminated by the flickering, smoky light of great iron torches. At their center sits your uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. He is the Lord High Steward for this trial, the man appointed by Henry to preside over your condemnation. You look directly into his eyes, old, cold, predatory eyes that have survived decades of Tudor politics by sacrificing anyone and everyone who threatened his family's advancement. He does not look back at you with the fondness of blood. He looks at you with the resentful fury of a businessman whose primary investment has failed and must now be liquidated to save the firm. Beside him sits your own father, Thomas Boleyn, Earl of Wiltshire. He sits with his head bowed, his hands trembling against his knees, a man who has traded his daughter's virtue and his own honor for titles and land, and who has now agreed to sit on the panel that will sentence his own children to death. This is the ultimate toxic reality of the world you tried to conquer, a world where even a father's love is a currency to be spent in the pursuit of power. You listen as the clerk reads the indictment, his voice echoing off the high timber roof of the hall. The words are monstrous, a parade of obscene, fabricated details that sound like something out of a dark, medieval fairy tale. You are accused of committing adultery with 5 different men, of poisoning the late Queen Catherine, of plotting to murder the king so that you could marry one of your lovers, and of laughing at the king's verses, mocking his clothes, and telling your brother that the king was incapable of knowing a woman. Every charge is a deliberate, precision-engineered insult designed to strip away your dignity and enrage the sovereign's massive, fragile ego. They are not just accusing you of breaking your marriage vows, they are accusing you of being an unnatural monster, a creature who defied the very laws of God and nature. When it is your turn to speak, you stand up from your carved chair and address the assembly. Your voice is not loud, but it possesses a clear, bell-like resonance that carries to the furthest corners of the crowded hall. You answer each charge with a cold, devastating logic that tears Cromwell's carefully constructed timeline to shreds. You point out that on the dates you were allegedly trysting with Henry Norris at Westminster, you were actually confined to your bed at Greenwich after a difficult birth. You note that the men accused of being your lovers were the king's most loyal servants, men who had spent their lives protecting his person, not plotting his assassination. You speak not with the frantic passion of a desperate defendant, but with the measured, ironic detachment of a scholar exposing a poorly written piece of fiction. One by one, the foreign observers in the crowd begin to whisper among themselves, realizing that there is no evidence, no proof, nothing but the tortured confessions of a low-born musician and the desperate, political need of a king who wants to be free. But, even as you deliver your brilliant defense, that the verdict was decided weeks ago in a private room at Whitehall. This trial is not an inquiry, it is an execution ceremony. When the peers are called upon to give their votes, each one stands up in turn, places his right hand over his heart, and pronounces the word that has been written for them by the king's will: guilty. You watch your uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, as he rises to deliver the final sentence. His voice, usually so loud and commanding, cracks with a strange, uncharacteristic emotion as the tears stream down his withered cheeks. He sentences you, his own niece, to be taken to the green within the tower, and there either to be burned at the stake or to have your head stricken off at the king's pleasure. You listen to the words without flinching, your face remaining a perfect, unreadable mask of marble. You bow to the court with an exquisite, courtly grace, turn your back on your judges, and walk out of the hall, leaving behind a silence that is heavier than any condemnation. 2 days later, you are forced to endure the ultimate heartbreak, the execution of your brother George and the 4 other gentlemen who were swept up in your ruin. From the window of your prison in the Queen's house, you can hear the distant, dull roar of the crowd gathered on Tower Hill outside the fortress walls. You cannot see the scaffold, but you can feel the precise moment when the axe falls, marked by the sudden, collective groan of the populace that drifts over the stone ramparts like a cold wind. Your brother is dead, the brilliant, witty young man who shared your love of poetry, your religious ideals, and your dangerous, French-inspired dreams, has been slaughtered because he was too close to your light. You fall to your knees on the oak floor, your black velvet skirts pooling around you, weeping not for your own neck, but for the beautiful, innocent lives that have been extinguished to clear the path for your replacement. You realize that you are already a ghost, a woman who has survived her own world, living in a terrifying limbo between the life you lost and the death that is waiting for you just across the courtyard. You spend your final night on Earth in a state of strange, luminous clarity. The frantic anxiety that plagued you during the early days of your imprisonment has entirely evaporated, replaced by a profound, spiritual stillness that feels like a gift from the God you have served in your own unorthodox way. You sit by the low-burning fire, a small book of hours resting open on your lap, watching the shadows dance across the stone walls of your chamber. You look at your life not as a tragedy, but as a magnificent, completed arc. You came from nothing, the granddaughter of a London merchant, and you climbed to the very top of the Christian world. You broke an ancient church, remade an empire, and gave birth to a daughter who carries your blood and your intellect in her veins. With a deep prophetic certainty that they cannot erase what you have done. Henry can burn your portraits. He can melt down your gold plate. He can command his chroniclers to strike your name from the official records of the realm. But he can never undo the revolution you started. Every time a parishioner reads an English Bible, every time a minister preaches the new faith from an English pulpit, they will be speaking your name in secret. You are not being destroyed. You are being woven into the very fabric of England's future, an indelible, eternal spirit that will outlive the tyrant who thinks he is defeating you with a piece of French steel. You are standing on the threshold of the Queen's house, and the cool, damp air of the May morning rushes over your face like a clean shroud. The long, agonizing wait is finally over. The delayed French executioner has arrived from Saint-Omer, his longsword unpacked and sharpened to a razor's edge. Sir William Kingston extends his arm to you, his hand shaking under the sleeve of his black woolen coat. But you do not need his support. You step out onto the gravel path of Tower Green with a light, almost weightless step. The sky above is a pale, pearlescent blue, completely devoid of clouds, a quiet and serene canopy that seems to mock the violent theater being staged below. Around the scaffold, a select crowd of about 200 dignitaries has gathered in a dense, silent knot. Among them Thomas Cromwell, his face an unreadable block of stone, and the king's illegitimate son, the young Duke of Richmond, sent to witness the final erasure of the woman who dared to reshape England. You walk toward the wooden platform, your black velvet gown rustling softly against the grass. You notice that the scaffold has been built remarkably low, barely 3 feet off the ground, a deliberate insult designed to ensure that the common people outside the tower walls cannot see your face when the blow is struck. They wanted you hidden. They wanted you small. But as you ascend the rough timber steps, your head is held as high as it ever was when you walked the long galleries of Hampton Court. You look down at the small gathering of men who have come to watch you die. There is no anger left in your dark eyes, no bitter venom on your tongue. The furious passions that defined your 7-year courtship and your 3-year reign have burned themselves down to a cold, magnificent ash. You look at them not as your executioners, but as witnesses to an act of supreme, royal dignity that none of them will ever be able to forget. You step up to the rail of the scaffold and address the crowd, your voice steady, clear, and perfectly pitched in the morning air. You do not use your final moments to scream your innocence or to denounce the judges who condemned you on a mountain of lies. To do so would risk the safety of your daughter, the infant Elizabeth, who remains at the mercy of a volatile king. Instead, you speak the traditional words of a queen submitting to the law of the realm. You tell them that you have come here to die, according to the law, and that you accuse no man, nor say anything of that whereof you are accused. You pray that God will save the king and send him long to reign over them, for he has been to you a very gentle, short, and sovereign prince. It is a speech of breathtaking, ironic genius, a masterclass in political subtlety that satisfies the letters of the law while leaving a lingering, haunting question mark over the justice of your execution. You have given them nothing they can use to justify their cruelty and everything they need to feel the crushing weight of their own guilt. You turn away from the crowd and face your weeping ladies in waiting, the few loyal women who refuse to abandon you to the wolves. You gently remove your heavy mantle of black velvet, exposing the vivid crimson silk of your kirtle underneath, a brilliant slash of color against the pale gray timber of the scaffold. One of your ladies steps forward with a white linen blindfold, her fingers trembling so violently that she can barely tie the knot behind your head. You help her, your touch calm and reassuring. The world goes black, the brilliant May sun, the pale blue sky, the sea of staring faces. All of it vanishes in an instant, leaving you alone in the absolute, velvety silence of your own mind. You can no longer see the executioner, a man who has cleverly hidden his long, heavy sword beneath the straw of the scaffold, so as to not panic you before the strike. You kneel down into the straw, your knees finding the cold, hard wood of the platform. You do not place your chin upon a traditional, clumsy wooden block. The French method requires you to sit upright, your back straight, your neck elongated, and completely exposed to the open air. You wrap your fingers gently around your throat, one last time, feeling the quick, rhythmic thud of your pulse beneath the skin, a heartbeat that is about to separate itself from the machinery of time. You begin to murmur your final, repetitive prayer into the darkness, your lips moving in a soft, melodic rhythm. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. The executioner steps quietly behind you, his soft leather boots making no sound against the timber. He does not want you to flinch, does not want you to move your head even a fraction of an inch before the steel finds its mark. To distract you, he calls out loudly toward the steps of the scaffold, "Bring me my sword." It is a brilliant, merciful trick. Hearing the voice away to your right, your mind naturally drifts toward the sound, your neck stretching out perfectly, your posture locking into absolute stillness. In that final millisecond of consciousness, as the word soul forms on your tongue for the last time, you hear a sudden, sharp whistle of displaced air behind your ear, a clean, metallic whisper that cuts through the silence of the morning, like a breath of wind through the apple blossoms. There is no pain. There is only a sudden, blinding flash of white light that instantly dissolves into a deep, velvety, and absolute dark. The long, exhausting game is over. The heavy crown of St. Edward has finally slipped from your brow, replaced by a profound, unshakable quiet that no king can ever disturb, no minister can ever manipulate, and no betrayal can ever break. The frantic noise of the Tudor court, the shouting heralds, the whispering diplomats, the roaring crowds of London fades away into a permanent, peaceful distance, leaving you to drift out into the cool, silent waters of eternity. You have stepped away from the banquet. You have entered the long, safe, and unbroken slumber of history, leaving behind an empty throne, a broken church, and a silence that will echo through the halls of England forever. Sleep now, Anne. The world is finally still.